European Union has appointed a new top diplomat. Kaja Kallas succeeds the Spanish socialist Josep Borrell as the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs. She stepped down as Estonian Prime Minister to take on this role. So who is Kaja Kallas and what will she bring to the job? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, she's known for her strong support of Ukraine and her early warnings about Russian expansionism. Kaja Kallas is now the EU's top diplomat on foreign policy and security. Let's take a closer look at who she is.
Kaja Kallas shattered Estonia's political glass ceiling, becoming the country's first female prime minister in 2021. After almost 7 years, leading the nation's Liberal Reform Party, she has stepped down to take on a fresh challenge. She's succeeding Josep Borrell as EU foreign policy chief, a role he's held since 2019. The Baltic leader will be back to the EU institutions' corridors, where she once served as European Parliament member. But this time, her agenda will be tougher.
There are two urgent priorities very close to us: Russia's war against Ukraine and the open conflict in the Middle East. Victory of Ukraine is a priority for us all. The situation on the battlefield is very difficult. And that is why we must keep on working every day, today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes, and with as much military, financial, and humanitarian aid as needed. This must be underpinned by a clear path for Ukraine to join the European Union.
Kallas became known as Europe's Iron Lady due to her strong support for Ukraine, delivering more military aid relative to GDP than any other country. Her backing of Ukraine comes as no surprise. Kallas grew up in a country once under Soviet rule and witnessed Estonia's fight for independence. She was just a teenager when the nation regained its freedom in 1991. With the re-election of Donald Trump, Kaja Kallas has taken a friendly stance, calling for a stronger cooperation between Europe and the United States. Something they will agree on will be increasing European defense spending. She has been critical of its underinvestment, but opposes the idea of an EU army. Only time will tell whether Europe's Iron Lady will succeed in implementing her plans as the leader of the European Union's foreign policy.
Well, let's meet our guests in Tallinn. James Oates, he is former chairman of the British-Estonian Chamber of Commerce. In Nashville, Tennessee, the former US presidential advisor Steve Gill. And I'm delighted to say in the studio, I'm joined by Dr. Cristian Nitoiu, senior lecturer in diplomacy and international affairs at Loughborough University, and former UK Home Office advisor Claire Pearsall. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. James, I'll come to you first. Kaja Kallas has been described as the Iron Lady of Europe. You know her personally. Give us your insight. What do you make of her?
I think the word I would use to describe Kaja most of all is competent. She's extremely efficient in her thinking. And so when she comes across, she is really a no-nonsense kind of personality. So you meet somebody like that and you expect them to be very efficient, and of course she is, but she's also quite inspirational. And that's one reason I think she's been so successful in speaking out since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So this competence, together with a certain sense of emotion, has been really powerful and has made her very much noticed amongst the prime ministers of Europe.
Cristian, to you, is Kallas exactly what the European Union and Europe needs right now?
Well, there's a bit of complexity here because I think on the one hand, she is very good in terms of bridging some of the inequality that has occurred in the European Union in the last 15 years since the last enlargement, because the member states from Eastern Europe, from the Baltic states as well, were always claiming that they didn't have a voice in the foreign policy of the European Union, that there wasn't any sense of equality. None of the big appointments up until Donald Tusk 10 years ago were made from these member states. So in a sense, this is a victory for that part of the European Union. But on the other hand, I would say that she is not particularly the best choice in this case. She would have been, let's say, 3-4 years ago when the European Union needed to drum up support in order to help Ukraine to tackle the Russian invasion. But now I think there's a lot of fatigue around people in the European Union. So we've seen the rise of nationalists in various countries in Europe. In Germany now, we're at the beginning of an economic recession. More nationalist and right-wing forces are equating, let's say, poverty in the country with the support that, Germany has given to Ukraine. So even in the UK, if, let's say, 3-4 years ago, you'd see a lot of Ukrainian flags here, people showing support for Ukraine. Now all of those flags are faded. So the European Union, I think, would have needed now someone who would focus more on solutions rather than playing up the anti-Russian narrative, because I think a lot of people in Europe are basically tired with this narrative. And if we think about the United States as well, there's a change of rhetoric there. There's, again, a focus on achieving peace and coming up with solutions for sustainable peace. So I'm not sure how she will basically collaborate with the United States on this issue.
Claire, you worked for many years with a strong female leader like Theresa May in Downing Street and in the Home Office. Give us your reading of a woman taking charge of European Union foreign policy.
I think this is really interesting, and I'm really pleased to see that Kaja Kallas has been put in that position. And you need a certain amount of pragmatism, which I do think she brings to the role. And as we've seen on the world stage, women are not normally there in front of world leaders. We're seeing it more and more, and the European Commission and the European Union itself elects way more women than I think the UK ever has, and certainly in the US. But I think she's going to have a very difficult time. She has been very strong on Russia and Ukraine, but not so much on things like what is happening in Africa and also what is happening in the Middle East. She doesn't seem to have that level of knowledge. Now, she could have that, and it just hasn't been shown at the moment. But I think you have to be pragmatic, you have to be strong, and you have to be able to stand up for what it is you believe. And I think that's what Theresa May showed, whether people agree with her or not. And I think that Kaja Kallas has similar qualities, so she should be okay.
You welcome another woman leading.
Absolutely. It is imperative that we get more women speaking out, imperative we get more women in politics at all levels. And if she can give that example to younger women coming through, that you can do this, you can actually be appreciated and listened to, then more power to her.
Steve, the relationship with the United States will be very, very important as ever. Your new president coming back in January is pushing 80 years of age. Kaja Kallas is 47, highly educated, very, very sharp, speaks languages. The dynamic between her and Donald J. Trump, it's very, very different.
And I think she speaks almost as many languages as Melania Trump, his wife, so they ought to get along very well. Donald Trump actually works well with strong women. He has filled his cabinet with strong women. His chief of staff is the first female chief of staff in U.S. history. So I think her strength is something that he'll respect and he can work with. He likes strong leaders. By the same token, I think you're right that it's going to take a different tone and a different approach with the U.S. than some of the bluff and bluster that she's spoken in the past. I mean, she's talked tough towards the U.S. and towards Trump. But then again, so did the president of Mexico until one phone call with Trump. And all of a sudden, Mexico is now going to shut off their southern border, effectively closing our border to illegal immigrants. Trudeau in Canada was talking tough as well until one phone call with Donald Trump. We now have a ceasefire in Lebanon with one phone call from Donald Trump. So I think her tough talk may play well in Estonia and in the EU, but I think her tone will change once she starts dealing with President Trump.
James, just tell me about her background a bit. Her dad was a politician. I read that her mother, grandmother and great-grandmother were deported by Stalin to Siberia for being anti-Soviet. How much do you think the family background will influence her view of European policy?
Oh, massively. And not only was her father a politician, he's and a previous prime minister, he was also the vice chairman of the European Commission, and she herself has been a member of the European Parliament. So she knows her way around Europe. Now, I accept that her experience in the Middle East is less, but the reality is that she knows how to hit the right buttons in Brussels. And I think that's really important. Now, you're absolutely right about the family connection. I mean, there's a famous story that she went with her family during the Soviet occupation of Estonia to the Brandenburg Gate and looked through, and Siim Kallas famously said, her father said, you're looking at freedom. And that really matters for Estonia. This is not a question of talking tough. This is existential. This is powerful. And I do think that actually she will have a reasonably good relationship with Donald Trump, because in many ways, Donald Trump and Siim Kallas have quite a bit in common, not just their generation, but just the way in which that they have been active in politics. So and occasionally they've been more than a little controversial. So I think that background means that I think she will be pragmatic in dealing with the new administration in Washington, but more, she will be able to deliver more from the European Union, I think, than people expect, because she's certainly no neophyte here.
Cristian, of Ukraine, Kaja Kallas has said your neighbour's problems today are your problems tomorrow. I mean, she was banging the drum about Russia, warning about Russia for a long time before anyone listened.
Well, the Baltic states as a whole, they've been sending alarm bells about Russia's potential aggression ever since they became members of the European Union. So this is not something new, but I would presume that with her at the helm of the European External Action Service, there will be more drive put towards the accession of Moldova and Ukraine. And there are a lot of voices, especially in Brussels, saying, okay, well, we have shown some sort of openness towards their accession, but there are so many stumbling blocks. The whole accession procedure is very cumbersome. So it might take 10 to 20 or even 30 years for that to happen. But I think, especially in Ukraine and Moldova, there's a lot of faith in her ability to drive forward this process and, let's say, give more voice to the needs of the Ukrainian and the Moldovan people. But at the end of the day, her position doesn't give her that much power. She can set some of the agenda of the European Union. She definitely represents the voice of the European Union, but the actual decisions are made by the member states. And she will probably need to work quite hard in order to convince some of the more reluctant member states, let's say like Austria or even the Netherlands, who've traditionally been quite skeptical of further enlargement.
Claire, I see you nodding in agreement. How difficult a job has she got? 27 different countries, whipping them all into line. I mean, you had difficulty whipping Conservative politicians to vote for Conservative policies.
And it's always difficult dealing with your own. I mean, that was probably the worst thing I had to do, was go begging politicians not to vote against something. But I think that the 27 member states are incredibly different. And you're right, Cristian, to point that out. It's going to be a big job, but I think that she understands politics well enough to see what is going to work within each member state and to how best to approach the process of bringing everybody together. Now, consensus building is tough and it takes a long time, but also we don't have that much time. If you look at what's happening with Ukraine and what's happening with Russia, there needs to be some kind of solution found soon. So I think it will be really interesting when Donald Trump becomes the president rather than president-elect, because he speaks very strongly. He wants a solution now. So I think with her consensus building, with his absolute determination, I think that actually this could be solved quite quickly. And I think that she has that power to bring those states together, even though there's going to be some of those states who have problems with what she's asking.
Steve, talk to me about Trump's interest in solving the Ukraine war and bringing a settlement and a peace deal. Is it a priority for him when he comes in January?
I think it's a priority for him now, and I would agree with the other guest that Ms. Kallas has a huge challenge, trying to deal with the 27 member states. There's a term, herding cats. She's going to have to herd rabid cats, and it's going to be a big challenge for her to have to deal with. President Trump wants to resolve the situation in Ukraine and Russia immediately. And I think you're already hearing that the checkbook is about to be closed, despite the provocative and very aggressive actions of Joe Biden on his way out, who seems determined to push us towards World War III with long-range missiles and forgiving debt and sending billions more to Ukraine, even as it seems to be coming to an end. I think President Trump's going to make it clear that the open checkbook is closed and that will get the parties to the table to negotiate. And I think that relatively quickly we'll see conversations begin. Whereas in Ukraine, under President Zelensky, it has been illegal to engage in negotiations. I think that'll change first, and then they'll get to the table.
James, just on that point, the phrase that jumps out at me is the checkbook is closing. How much of a problem is that for Europe then in terms of funding and financing Ukraine and their resistance?
Well, the first statement that the incoming Commission President has made has been, if you're going to support Ukraine, you're going to have to open your checkbook. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask that. Now, I do think that it takes two to tango, and you're dealing with a regime in Moscow which is clinging on by its fingernails economically. I mean, you can hear even across the border the damage that is being done into their economy. And there may come a point where it's not just the West that is asking for negotiations, but the Russians as well. And I'm sure that Kaja Kallas will be making that point fairly firmly, both in Washington and in Brussels. She has been very astute in building sensible coalitions, not just domestic coalitions in Estonia, but also don't forget that she is not part of the European People's Party, which is the dominant force in the new commission. And that's kind of interesting because it makes her slightly of an outsider, but it enables her to build bridges across the European parliamentary fractions. And I think that, her experience and the way that she has worked in the past will be able to pull something stronger together. But at the end of the day, and this is not just a Baltic thing, this is not just a Nordic thing, but across Europe, we're seeing direct threats, including, I may say, in Ireland, where infrastructure is being targeted by Russian military forces. Now, that's a direct challenge to NATO, regardless of Ukraine. And I think that it's going to be a slower process, perhaps, than the incoming administration would like. And I think we need to be very careful that we don't misstep. And I'm sure, again, that Kaja Kallas will talk carefully about the direct threats.
Cristian, let's talk about immigration. Huge issue across the European Union, 27 member states, and they all have varying degrees of interest in this. How much of an issue do you think she will make it? It's not number one priority for her, but it won't be far off.
Well, I think there are some member states that are more affected, definitely those in the south, Greece, Italy, for example. And probably for her, that won't be at the top of her agenda. Ukraine, future enlargement, tackling Russia, those are the main priorities. But probably in order to get some of those southern member states on board, she will need to make some compromises and put migration on the agenda as well. But migration is also important, for example, for Hungary. Maybe some deals may be made between her and Orban, even though I'm not really sure that she would want to engage with him in any meaningful way. But I think there is scope for engaging with some of the countries that deal with migration are on the front line of what is happening in terms of migration. But again, I don't think that will be one of her main priorities. And there are other parts of the European Commission that also deal with this.
Claire, your time in the Home Office in London, you had first-hand experience of working on the whole immigration issue. For Kaja Kallas, where do you think that ranks in terms of what she needs to do in the next 5 years?
I think it is important. It's not going to be right at the top of her agenda, given the brief that she has. But you can't help but see the need for security within the EU and migration. They are very, very similar subjects. You can't have one without the other. So I would suggest that she's going to have to do an awful lot of negotiating, have a long conversation with people like Giorgia Meloni to see how that is working in Italy, because we're all still waiting to see whether that will work. I know the United Kingdom is also looking at that quite heavily, and so are other countries such as Germany, I think, are quite interested. So it's going to be an interlinked conversation that she's going to have. So it may not be top of her agenda, but it is always going to feature in those negotiations. It's going to have to. It affects everybody across the 27 countries and also wider into places like the United States, where they have a massive problem with migration, and also in the UK, even though we're separate from the EU, we still suffer the same issues.
But the issue of migration in Europe is driving a lot of the support for the far right, isn't it? Because this is what people are of that persuasion are very, very concerned about.
Yes, it does. And you can break that down and you understand why people have concerns when they see a large number of people coming into a country that cannot take it, the infrastructure cannot cope. But also the legal migration. So you've got illegal migration, you've got legal migration, and especially in the United Kingdom, which are two separate issues. But yes, of course, you have to look at it. National security has to be first and foremost in everybody's minds, but also the labour needs of each country has to be taken into account. It's a fine balancing act. So I think people are very unhappy when governments impose something on them. If you take people along in a journey and say, actually, we're going to have caps, as the United Kingdom would quite like to have, and America are quite keen to see limited numbers of people coming across their borders, then I think you have to have a pretty nuanced conversation. But people are angry at the moment, and if you don't deal with that, I think you will see more of those nationalist parties rise.
Steve, what advice would you give Kaja Kallas when it comes to dealing and doing business with Donald J. Trump?
Develop a personal relationship. He relies very heavily on those personal relationships and recognize that his issues are broader than just the Russia-Ukraine fight or even illegal immigration, as was just pointed out. That was a big issue in our election. It certainly was a big issue in the UK elections, as I think voters there said, look, if the Tories aren't going to deal with it, Labour says they're not going to, we might as well let them not deal with the issue. And I think in some of her member countries, it is a top priority, even if it's not hers. The other thing I would say with Donald Trump, she needs to recognize that his main focus is going to be to restore the American economy, and that lifts all boats. If we restore our energy independence and drill, baby, drill, as he had said, that will lower energy costs, will help the economy nationally and internationally. I think the threat of tariffs are something that you'll hear about, but what he really wants is to open and have fair trade across borders. So I think she's going to have to recognize that one of Trump's top priorities is to restore the American economy, and that will help the EU economy as well.
James, she's hugely qualified. I think, the profile she's getting, people really rate this woman. I mean, what's your impression of her from the time you spent with her?
Well, she is very much somebody who thinks before she acts. She's trained as a lawyer and she considers the brief in full. I certainly think that what Steve says about personal relationship is very interesting, and I think actually she will be quite adept at being able to engage with him. Bear in mind that Estonia, like most of the Central and Eastern European states, are pretty pro-American in general. I mean, the Atlantic Alliance is the first sort of lodestone, really, of international policy, and she carries that with her. Now, accepting the issues of the south of the European Union and the issues of the Mediterranean, and I think that will be where she will need to get up to speed faster. But the reality is, I think she is well qualified, as you say, in terms of her intellectual background, in terms of her connections inside the European Union administration and in the Parliament. She will be able, I think, to bring deals onto the floor of the European Parliament and make them stick. And that's not always been the case with previous external affairs commissioners. So I think she will be effective, notwithstanding the challenges that she clearly will face. And I think that preparation is something she's very good at, and I know that that's what she's doing right now. And she's been in Brussels this last week, obviously going through the confirmation process, but also engaging with her staff to think more and more about what the policy agenda has to be. And clearly there is a sense of urgency in terms of time, and not just with Ukraine.
Cristian, what will success look like then for the next 5 years, European Union foreign policy under Kaja Kallas? What will she be happy achieving?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, to be honest. Her appointment does send a message that the European Union is looking more inward now. It's more focused on its own survival, on its own resilience, on dealing primarily with Russia. So this sends a clear message to other partners around the world. Think about the BRICS countries, for example, or Latin America. For them, it's probably a message that they're not a priority for the European Union anymore. At the same time, she's been quite hawkish in terms of criticizing authoritarian regimes around the world. So I presume it will be very difficult for her to engage with people like Prime Minister Modi in India, or leaders in China, for example, or even in Brazil. So success probably will be moving forward the enlargement towards Ukraine and Moldova, settling in a Ukrainian way, let's say, in a very favorable way towards Ukraine, the war with Russia. Even though I would say that's very difficult, I would have a different opinion than some of the other people in the panel here. I think with Donald Trump, we had 4 years when he was in power, and there was another ceasefire called the Minsk Agreements, and there was absolutely no progress on moving that forward. And both the Ukrainians and the Russians have very clear views on how to end the war, which are quite opposed. We might have a fragile ceasefire for, 6 months, but a sustainable peace is very difficult. If either Kallas or Trump contribute to that, I think that will be a huge achievement, and that, I think, would be a measure of success in absolute terms.
Claire, final point to you, Claire. Just tell me, can she achieve all of this?
I think it's a pretty tough order. I think the one thing she's got to do is provide consensus within the EU 27. I think that's her biggest task. Now, if she can do that, that is a huge achievement, and she needs to be congratulated for it. Everything else, I mean, it is a massive task. You can't say from day one that somebody is going to have success. We don't know. There are so many moving parts, but I think it's going to be a very interesting journey to watch.
And watch it we will, Claire. Cristian, Steve and James, thank you all so much for your insight on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.